Welcome, everyone. Good to be with you today here at 15 Minutes and a Big Idea. Probably to the surprise of no one, this episode is also going to be a content warning episode. We're going to be having a frank discussion of sexuality, not sexual immorality, as we did last time, but sexuality within marriage. So two things about that. First is if you got young ears around, you probably want to filter this. I will say that I was blessed when I got into marriage by having heard these things before I got married in my late teens and early 20s and things like that. So I do think this content is helpful. It is important, but you probably are going to want to make sure that you've got the right audience around as you're listening to it. The second thing is this is very much a two-part episode. This episode and the next episode are going to go together, and so if you want to know what the Bible says on this topic and about this text and what I'm saying about it, you really got to get both episodes in. If you only listen to one, it's going to maybe feel a little bit off. You may be like, do you mean this? Well, listen to both, and then you can accuse me of misrepresentation or not getting something right. If you got questions, drop them in the comments below. There's certainly going to be questions on this. We'll circle back to those with the Q and R. If you're on the podcast, send those over to the podcast email. Find it in the show notes below. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 4. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 4. Now concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. But because of sexual immoralities, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband. The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise the wife also to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Today we're starting this new discussion, which is substantially different than what we looked at in chapter 6, but it's also deeply connected to what we saw in chapter 6, for reasons that will be clear as we step into it. Chapter 6 began with a discussion of lawsuits between Christians, which led to the principle that we don't need to be vindicated all the time. It's acceptable to be wronged, defrauded, or dishonored. If we're able to endure the loss and still meet our other obligations, we should be open to just being wronged and allow that to happen and forbearing with it. Further, taking these things to unrighteous judges as they were doing is nonsensical because the unrighteous won't inherit the kingdom, which Paul describes those sorts of people with a list of various vices that he goes on to talk about, which he acknowledged formally defined the Corinthians, that before God fundamentally remade them, they were this way. To this, Paul turns to the fact that they have been made new. And from this, he launches into a discussion of sexual sin, arguing that our bodies are for God's purposes, our bodies are parts of Christ's body, and our bodies are possessed by God, which then, leads to this emphatic call to flee, to run from sexual sin. Out of that, Paul is going to transition to what we mentioned as a complementary topic, which is marriage. But there's loads of principles that funnel into that discussion, and so Paul is going to take some extended excursions in this text, and of course we'll take them as well with him. The first couple of sections here, as we mentioned in our content warning or our disclaimer there, deals with proper sexual expression within marriage, and it's overarched by our big idea today, which is that spouses have mutual authority. Spouses have mutual authority. To understand that, we want to look at number 1, marriage maintains purity. Number 2, spouses have responsibility. And 3, your body is your spouse's. Marriage maintains purity, spouses have responsibility, and your body is your spouse's. Purity, responsibility, and body will be the words that kind of govern each of those points. Our first idea comes from these first 2 verses. Paul starts by addressing that these things were written to him, or there's some things that were written to him. And it's generally thought, and I concur, that Paul will now use this phrase, now concerning, throughout the rest of the letter to describe various aspects of the things they wrote to him about. In this case, he's addressing questions in regard to sexual expression within marriage. As examples, he'll use the phrase now concerning in chapter 7, verse 25 with regard to the unmarried, in chapter 8 to refer to food offered to idols, chapter 12 to refer to spiritual gift, and then chapter 16 for the collection of the saints. I think there may be a couple others. When he uses that phrase, it's a definite topic shift. And it almost always bears the nature of a clarification of some sort. So I tend to think that sort of forms the structural backbone of this part of the letter, really from chapter 7 to about chapter 16. So the second half of the letter is about him dealing with these questions that they sent him. So there's something here that the Corinthians have written. Now, what exactly is that? Well, we'll deal with that. Paul writes in this letter, he says, "It is good for a man not to touch a woman." And this is, once again, where we're left to ask, is that something that Paul's saying, or is perhaps he quoting something that they're asserting? In the first case, Paul is continuing the line of thought on avoiding sexual immorality. And on the second, it's a response to this libertine sexual expression discussed in chapter 6 and other places, chapter 5, that there arose a belief that sexual activity is wrong in any setting, even in marriage. I tend towards the second thing there, that there's kind of two parallel issues. There's this free expression that's off the rails, and then there's this sort of puritanical overreaction that goes with that, and he's dealing with it there. Regardless, Paul is saying that marriage is the divinely approved and instituted outlet for sexual expression and sexual intimacy. This notes that for many, sex is a biological need. It's in order to avoid this. Marriage is the outlet for that. Sexuality within marriage is pure, and it's to be celebrated. It's not less than. It's a joyful experience of intimacy in the truest and deepest sense with a fellow human. While sex outside of marriage is impure and it is damaging to us, so one is intimacy and life-giving and holy, the other is impure and damaging. Whenever sex is between two mutually sacrificial and loving spouses, so we'll outline kind of next couple points and next week, that's holy and it's life-giving instead of impure and damaging. Next, Paul gives a tempering of this principle to understand how serious he is about sexuality within marriage to avoid sexual sin. He says in no uncertain terms, the husband is to fulfill his duty to his wife, and the wife also to her husband. This is probably worth a whole episode in and of itself, and we'll probably come back to this in a Q&R or a special episode, not quite sure, because there's just so much to say about this. But this phrase, duty here, or rights, is a euphemism for sex that construes it as an obligation. In fact, this is really just assumed. We'll unpack what this does and doesn't mean, as we say, moving forward. But I believe the principle that Paul is getting at, which we're kind of going to frame this as, is that spouses should have a posture of sexual availability toward their partner. Let me say that again. Spouses should have a posture of sexual availability toward their partner. Exodus 21, 10 and 11 deals with the obligations of a husband in marriage, and these include food, clothing, and conjugal rights for the husband, or sex towards his spouse. And if a man fails to provide that in this particular setting, the wife is free to leave. Notice in both these cases, sexual intimacy is assumed to be a right of marriage. It comes as part of the package. We need to stop and think about this, and we need to think about how we think about this and perhaps how we feel about it so that we can think rightly about it and acknowledge some of the trouble here. First, the notion that there are marital responsibilities is not controversial in any sense. In any way, in many ways, marriage is an institution that exists to codify these obligations in a covenant between these two people. There's that marriage covenant. That means there's obligations that we are promising to uphold. Second, the notion that there are transcendent marital responsibilities is also not controversial. Even if many things are particular to a culture or a certain group of people, every culture believes there's things that are just in the fiber of marriage, which may be unspoken, but you don't have to say it because it's just part of the deal. For example, in Western culture shaped by the Bible, the notion that each spouse is entitled to the love and affection of their respective spouse is completely uncontroversial. We believe that. Spouses deserve the love of the other. And even if people don't agree with the Bible, they agree with that you're worthy of your spouse's love by being in marriage. It's what you signed out for. The Bible certainly has something to say about this, and that part of marriage's function is to provide an outlet for this biological need. That's one of the functions that it plays. Paul assumes that sexual intimacy would be sufficiently routine within marriage because that's what he prescribes as a solution to sexual sin, that if people don't have the self-control and they're within marriage, that's where you have the outlet for this biological need. All right, so as we come to this third point here, let's revisit that statement that I kind of gave as an overview of Paul's discussion here. And like I say, those instructions, we're going to revisit that in the next episode because these are really a pair. Paul explains that there are things that are fundamental to the marriage covenant. And one of these things is that spouses should have a posture of sexual availability toward their partner. The wife, as he says, doesn't have power over her body, but the husband does. The husband doesn't have power over his body, but the wife does. This is because in marriage, and most especially in sexuality, we quite literally become one body in that unity. There's a surrendering of ourselves to our spouse. So for one spouse to blatantly and continually refuse to be joined to the other is to defy these instructions. Let me say that again. A spouse blanketly and continually, persistently refusing to be joined to their spouse sexually is to defy these instructions. One spouse refusing the other sexually because they simply don't want to is sinful. That's sinful. Now, is that to say refusing once or refusing ever is a sin? Certainly not. Certainly not. Get me on that. Certainly not. It's not saying there's never a license to refuse, which we'll talk about next time more extensively. That's why you got to listen to both episodes. But as I've repeated, spouses should have a posture, a disposition, a bias of sexual availability toward their partner. That means there should be a good faith openness to engage sexually with a spouse as a practice. There is a reality here of different levels of desire in spouses. There's a stereotype that men always have higher drive, but that's not the case. Notice the passage begins by saying that husbands have the obligation to their wife as well. And if we think about this as some sort of imbalance, there's some sense in which when it comes to marriage, when it comes to sex, that's a place where we really are on equal terms, that there's no real headship principle that Paul plays out here. He's going to do that in other places in Corinthians, but here it doesn't play out. That this is one of the places where it's truly, in some sense, mutually working together to figure out the best way to live this out in a way that honors each other. The other thing I want to mention here, well, there's different levels of desire. Desire is not static. It changes, it fluctuates based on biological rhythms and cycles, fitness, stress levels, and health in general. There's a reality of time, energy levels, and obligations. This passage is definitely saying that if your spouse has a desire for sex, there's some level of responsibility that you bear to work with that because they have power over your body. However, on the flip side, I want to say this. If you are the one with the stronger desire, the desire to engage sexually with your spouse in a particular moment, but your spouse doesn't in that moment, you need to recognize your body belongs to them as well. It's not just that the person who has less desire that their body belongs, but the person with more desire, their body mutually belongs to each other. And so as such, because your body belongs to your spouse, it is not yours to impose on them. So that's where we land on this notion of oneness, of unity of heart and mind. This is about mutual self-giving love. Whatever situation I'm in, I need to seek the path that honors my spouse and their needs. This text should be used as an open-handed appeal to serve one another, not as a club to subdue your spouse, even if they may be not filling up or fulfilling the obligation there as is needed. Now, let me say this. I'm really trying to be even-handed as we kind of circle this here. We live in a sex-saturated culture where many people, men and women, enter into marriage with a warped view of sexuality. And because of pornography and other media that's exploitative and it's harmful to people. Others, because of that, have a view that sex is dirty and wrong and an unfortunate reality of nature that's just kind of inconvenient, but we have to deal with it. And while that's not, or it's likely not as abusive as the former can be in its worst state, it's still harmful. And I bring up these disparate views because where you sit on that spectrum, or any spectrum in this discussion, is going to change what God's calling you to do. As we've said, and I will say again, while a spouse must not accept their partner's advances every single time, spouses should have a posture of sexual availability toward their partner. There should be a holy willingness to be joined intimately to your spouse in a way that brings you together and that serves them. We'll keep the questions simple this time. And if any of these hit you, I want to encourage you to talk to your spouse and seek good biblical counsel in the church community that will help both of you find the path forward for your marriage. Also, come back next week to hear the entirety of the case and the entirety of the discussion, because as I said, It's all context here. You got to have both pieces. Assuming you're married, because that's who these questions are going to go to towards today. Do you have a posture of sexual availability toward your spouse? Would your spouse describe you as generally available or usually unavailable for intimacy? What percentage of their serious advances and attempts at initiation do you rebuff? Do you ignore? Do you change the subject? Make an excuse? Do you believe that your body belongs to them? Do you work with them to find fullness in this area for both of you? Are you helping your spouse avoid sexual immorality? Or are you making their holiness more difficult? Thank you so much for joining us today here at 15 Minutes and a Big Idea. Today's big idea: spouses have mutual authority.